We are back with more of our conversation with Amal and George Clooney. Look at the way these two look at each other. I can't get over this. The power couple joined us in studio on a very big day for them. It was their 8th wedding anniversary.
For decades, George Clooney was one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood. He was the actor who seemed to have everything: worldwide fame, critical success, unforgettable charm, and a lifestyle that millions imagined was the definition of freedom. Yet behind the carefully polished image of Hollywood's favorite bachelor was a story that few people expected to see unfold. The man who once joked about never marrying again eventually became a husband, a father, and one half of one of the world's most admired celebrity couples. His relationship with Amal Clooney changed the way many people viewed him. But what made this transformation so fascinating was not just the romance itself. It was the question of how a man who spent so many years protecting his independence learned to build a life around someone else. Among the people who witnessed this change from close range was Brad Pitt. The two actors became friends while working together on the legendary Ocean's film series. Audiences saw two movie stars creating unforgettable chemistry on screen, but behind the cameras was a friendship built on years of shared experiences, humor, and mutual respect. Brad Pitt knew the version of George Clooney that existed before Amal entered his life. He knew the man who could walk into any room and instantly become the center of attention. He knew the actor who could make an entire film set laugh with a single joke. He knew the person behind the public image. And that is what makes George Clooney's journey so interesting. Because the biggest change in George's life was never simply that he found love. The biggest change was that he allowed himself to be changed by it. For many years, George Clooney had become almost synonymous with bachelorhood. His confidence, his humor, and his independence created an image that seemed impossible to break. He was not simply a single man. He had turned being single into part of his identity. Hollywood had many famous bachelors, but George was different. He seemed completely comfortable with the idea that marriage was not something he needed. He often joked about his past marriage and suggested that he had no plans to walk down the aisle again. After his first marriage to actress Talia Balsam ended in divorce in 1993, George spent many years focusing on his career, friendships, and personal freedom. His relationships attracted constant media attention, but he appeared determined to maintain control over his own life. From the outside, it looked like George had created the perfect formula. He had success without compromise. He had fame without losing himself. He had built a world where he answered only to his own choices. But people who knew him understood something deeper. The humor that made George famous was also one of his greatest defenses. His ability to turn serious moments into jokes was part of his charm. It was also a way of keeping emotional distance. That does not mean George was unhappy. In fact, many people close to him have described him as someone who valued friendships deeply and cared greatly about the people around him. But there is a difference between loving people and allowing someone to completely become part of your life. That difference would become clear when Amal Clooney entered the picture. Their meeting in 2013 became one of the most talked about moments in modern celebrity history. George met Amal through mutual friends at his home near Lake Como, Italy. At the time, neither the public nor George himself could have predicted how much that meeting would change his future. Amal was unlike anyone George had previously been linked with. She was not trying to become famous. She already had an impressive career as an international human rights lawyer. Her reputation came from her professional achievements, intelligence, and dedication to global issues. She entered George's world, but she was not defined by it. And that was likely one of the things that made their connection different. George Clooney had spent decades being the person everyone wanted to meet. But Amal was someone who had her own accomplishments, her own priorities, and her own identity. She did not need Hollywood. She did not need the attention. She did not need the image of George Clooney. She was interested in the person behind it. That kind of relationship requires something different from someone who has spent years being admired by millions. It requires vulnerability. And for George Clooney, vulnerability may have been the biggest change of all. When George proposed to Amal in 2014, the announcement surprised many people. The man who had spent years saying marriage was not for him was suddenly preparing for one of the biggest commitments of his life. Their wedding in Venice, Italy, became a global event. The ceremony included famous guests, beautiful surroundings, and the kind of elegance many people associated with George Clooney. But behind all the attention was something much simpler. A man who once believed he had already decided what his future would look like had discovered that sometimes life changes the plans people make for themselves. Brad Pitt and George Clooney's friendship made many fans curious about what Brad thought of this transformation. After all, Brad had also experienced the pressure of living under intense public attention. He understood what happened when private relationships became global stories. He knew that fame could create an illusion. People often see photographs, interviews, and public appearances and believe they understand a relationship completely. But the reality of any marriage exists away from cameras. And that is perhaps the most important lesson from George and Amal Clooney's story. Their marriage was never interesting because it looked perfect. It was interesting because it represented change. The Hollywood bachelor became a husband. The actor known for independence became a father. The man who once seemed satisfied with his own world created a new world with someone else. In 2017, George and Amal welcomed twins, Ella and Alexander. Fatherhood brought another major transformation. Suddenly, George's life was no longer only about film projects, travel, and personal freedom. There were new responsibilities, new priorities, a completely different definition of success. George later spoke openly about how much fatherhood changed him. He described becoming a parent as one of the greatest experiences of his life. For someone who had spent so many years carefully protecting his independence, becoming a father represented a new chapter. And perhaps that is what Brad Pitt recognized most clearly. Not a scandal, not a secret, but a transformation. A man who once built his life around never needing anyone discovered the power of building a life with someone. The arrival of George and Amal Clooney's twins marked a turning point that even longtime friends could recognize. For years, George had been known as the man who could walk away from anything whenever he wanted. His career allowed him that freedom. His fame allowed him that freedom. His lifestyle allowed him that freedom. But parenthood changed the rules. Suddenly, there were two little people who did not care about Hollywood success, magazine covers, or the reputation of a movie star. They needed their father's attention, his patience, and his presence. That was a completely different kind of responsibility. And perhaps that was the real transformation that people close to George noticed. Before Amal, George Clooney was known for controlling his own story. He decided what projects to take, where to live, and how much of himself the public would see. He had mastered the art of maintaining privacy while still being one of the most famous people in the world. But marriage and fatherhood required something different. They required compromise. They required patience. They required showing up even when there were no cameras and no applause. For someone who had spent decades being celebrated for his independence, this was a new challenge. The public often sees marriage as a romantic ending, but in reality, marriage is where the real story begins. The wedding day is only one moment. The years afterward reveal who people truly are. And this is where George Clooney's story became more interesting. Because Amal Clooney did not enter his life to complete something that was missing. She entered his life as someone who challenged him to see the world differently. Amal's career placed her in a completely different environment from George's Hollywood world. She worked in international law, dealing with serious global issues far removed from movie premieres and entertainment headlines. Her professional identity existed independently from George's fame. That balance was likely one of the reasons their relationship attracted so much attention. They were not simply two celebrities creating a glamorous Hollywood romance. They represented two different worlds coming together. One built around storytelling, entertainment, and public performance. The other built around law, human rights, and international responsibility. George had spent much of his life mastering the art of being liked by everyone. Amal's world demanded something different. It demanded conviction, preparation, and the courage to stand for difficult causes. Their relationship showed that sometimes the strongest partnerships are created not because two people are identical, but because they bring different strengths into each other's lives. Brad Pitt understood something about this. He knew George before Amal. He knew the actor who could turn every uncomfortable moment into a joke. He knew the friend who used humor to connect with people. He knew the performer who could make millions of strangers feel like they knew him. But friendship also means seeing what exists underneath the performance. And like many longtime friends, Brad likely understood that George's public confidence was only one part of who he was. The image of George Clooney was effortless. The reality of George Clooney was more complicated. Behind the famous smile was someone who valued loyalty, friendship, and family deeply. The difference was that before Amal, those qualities were mostly expressed through friendships and professional relationships. After Amal, they became part of a family life. This change also affected how the world viewed George's friendships, including his famous friendship with Julia Roberts. George and Julia's connection has always fascinated audiences. Their chemistry began with the Ocean's movies and continued through later projects, including Ticket to Paradise. They have one of those rare Hollywood friendships where conversation appears effortless and the humor feels natural. Fans often noticed their ability to make each other laugh. They had a shared history. They understood the strange experience of being famous around the world. But friendship in Hollywood is often misunderstood. A close friendship between two actors can easily become a source of speculation, especially when both people have such strong public chemistry. However, those who know the entertainment industry understand that decades of friendship do not automatically mean anything more. Sometimes two people simply share a rare connection because they have experienced similar lives. Julia Roberts and George Clooney both understood the unusual pressure of fame. They understood what it meant to be recognized everywhere they went. They understood what it felt like to have strangers believe they knew everything about them. That shared understanding created a bond. But the arrival of Amal changed the context. George was no longer simply the famous actor and friend. He was a husband and father. His priorities had expanded. His responsibilities had grown. And that was the real story behind the change people noticed. Not that George had lost his old personality, but that he had gained new dimensions. The funny, charming, confident George Clooney was still there. But now there was another side. The family man. The father. The husband. The person thinking about a future beyond Hollywood. This is something many people experience when they reach a new stage of life. The person they were before does not disappear. Instead, new experiences become part of who they are. George did not stop being the man everyone recognized. He simply became more than that. And this is where the friendship between Brad Pitt and George Clooney becomes especially interesting. Both men have lived under enormous public attention. Both have experienced the strange reality of being admired by millions while still trying to maintain a private life. Both know that fame can make people believe they understand a person when they only know the public version. Brad Pitt's own life has been intensely covered by the media for decades. His relationships, family, and personal challenges have often become subjects of public discussion. Because of that experience, he likely understands the importance of separating reality from headlines. A celebrity marriage is rarely as simple as outsiders believe. A photograph does not reveal everything. A public appearance does not reveal everything. A few words in an interview do not reveal everything. The real relationship exists in ordinary moments. The conversations nobody hears. The compromises nobody sees. The decisions made when there are no cameras around. And that may be the most important part of George Clooney's marriage story. It is not about a famous actor finally getting married. It is about a person allowing himself to experience a different kind of life. For years, George Clooney's identity was built around freedom. After meeting Amal, his identity expanded to include responsibility. And while some people might see responsibility as a limitation, George appeared to view it differently. He found meaning in it. He found purpose in it. He found a reason to think beyond himself. That is the real reason George Clooney's marriage became such a powerful story. Because it challenged the idea that people never change. For decades, the world believed it understood George Clooney. The charming bachelor. The Hollywood legend. The man who had everything figured out. Then Amal arrived and revealed another side of him. A side that was quieter. A side that was more vulnerable. A side that wanted something deeper than fame. And perhaps that was the biggest surprise of all. The man who seemed to have everything discovered that the greatest thing he could have was not another achievement. It was connection. The story of George Clooney's marriage is ultimately not a story about a Hollywood celebrity changing his relationship status. It is a story about identity, growth, and the unexpected ways people evolve when they meet someone who challenges their understanding of life. For years, George Clooney had convinced the world that he had everything exactly the way he wanted it. And maybe, in many ways, he did. He had built a remarkable career. He had earned respect as an actor, director, and producer. He had surrounded himself with loyal friends. He had created a life filled with travel, creativity, and independence. But sometimes the life people carefully build is not always the life they are meant to remain in forever. That is what made Amal Clooney's arrival so significant. She did not erase the person George had been. She revealed the person he could become. The biggest misconception about personal transformation is that someone has to become a completely different person. But real change is often quieter than that. It is not about replacing who someone was. It is about discovering parts of themselves they never had a reason to show before. George Clooney was still the man who loved humor. He was still the friend who enjoyed making people laugh. He was still the actor who could command attention in any room. But after Amal, there was another layer to his life. There was someone waiting for him at home. There were children depending on him. There were responsibilities that could not be solved with charm alone. And perhaps that was the greatest challenge. Charm can open doors. Charm can create opportunities. Charm can make people admire you. But in a marriage and family, charm is not enough. A person has to be present. They have to listen. They have to compromise. They have to show the parts of themselves that are not always polished. And that may have been the most meaningful change in George Clooney's journey. The world knew George Clooney, the movie star. Amal knew George Clooney, the person. That difference is something many famous people struggle with. When millions of people love the image of someone, it can become difficult to know who truly sees the real person behind it. But relationships are built in the private moments. The quiet conversations. The difficult decisions. The ordinary days that never appear in magazines. That is where real connection is created. And according to public interviews, George has often spoken about how much his family means to him. He has described fatherhood as something that changed his perspective and gave him a different understanding of life. The same man who once joked about avoiding marriage became someone who openly embraced being a husband and father. That contrast is what fascinated fans around the world. Because it proved that people are not always defined by their past statements. People change. People grow. People discover new priorities. And perhaps Brad Pitt, as one of George's longtime friends, would understand that better than most. Brad and George share a unique connection because they experienced Hollywood from a similar position. Both became global stars. Both dealt with constant media attention. Both understood the pressure of maintaining a public image. But they also understood something else. Fame does not automatically create happiness. Success does not eliminate loneliness. Being admired is not the same as being understood. That is why George's relationship with Amal became such an interesting chapter. It was not simply about romance. It was about finding someone who existed outside the Hollywood bubble. Someone who could challenge him. Someone who could bring a different perspective. Someone who was not impressed only by the things that impressed everyone else. And that might be the quality that made their relationship stand out. Amal did not meet George Clooney at the beginning of his journey. She met him after he had already achieved everything many people dream about. She met him when he was already famous, already successful, already respected. And yet, their relationship showed that even people who appear to have everything can still experience a new beginning. This is also why comparisons between George's life before and after Amal became so common. Before Amal, George represented independence. After Amal, he represented partnership. Before Amal, his future seemed focused on his own choices. After Amal, his future included choices made together. Neither version was wrong. The bachelor years were part of who he was. They shaped his personality, his career, and his worldview. But they were not the final chapter. The arrival of family created a new chapter. And that is something many people can relate to. Life is not always about reaching a final destination. It is about becoming someone new through the experiences we never expected. George Clooney never planned to become the person he became. But that does not make the transformation less real. It makes it more meaningful. The public often searches for dramatic explanations behind celebrity relationships. They want secrets. They want hidden conflicts. They want a shocking revelation. But sometimes the truth is much simpler. Sometimes a person meets someone who changes their perspective. Sometimes someone arrives at exactly the moment when they are ready to see life differently. And sometimes the greatest surprise is not that a person found love. The greatest surprise is that love helped them discover a side of themselves they had never fully explored. That appears to be the most interesting part of George Clooney's marriage. Not the wedding. Not the celebrity attention. Not the headlines. The transformation. The journey from someone